So I'm going to ask our panelists to unmute themselves, and if everybody else can be muted, that would be great. And we'll get started shortly. We have you can see at the top of the screen the hashtag Ask a Practitioner. That is the channel in Slack that we're using for questions here. So if you can switch over to that channel for any questions for the panel. We're first of all going to have them go through, each of them will, can briefly introduce themselves and then talk about some of the most important trends that they've seen happen in the last year or so. What's the most important development that's happening in this year and next year, and then a little longer view out on the next 5 years. So that gives you an idea of what's going to be coming up here. Okay, so if we're ready to kick off, what we can do is I'll leave this slide up for a couple of minutes just so that you kind of get a chance to see the names and what the questions are and so on. And then what I'll do is I'll stop screen sharing, because then that lets us go to a gallery view, which is going to show you more of the panel with their video on if they have their video on. So Bob, why don't we start with you? If you can just briefly introduce yourself and then tell us about what you think are the most important trends that have been happening and what you see happening in the future.
Okay, so I'm Bob Moore. I've been working in business rules since 1989. I haven't actually been working for the last couple of years. I've had some personal issues which have prevented that. So I couldn't really say I know, I've got my kind of finger on the pulse of exactly what's going on at the moment. But what would seem to me to be the kind of important trends, I think, are the kind of growing hype of AI and machine learning to the point where it's kind of gone beyond what's actually practical. And I think a lot of the remarks that Sylvie made and probably things that James is going to refer to in terms of people losing sight of where they're going is going to continue for a while. And I think that things are going to come down with a bit of a crash, and people are going to realize that they're asking the wrong questions, and if they're asking the wrong questions, they're going to get the wrong answers. So I think that the important developments sort of coming probably, 18 months, couple of years times, people will start actually kind of refocusing on what it is they're trying to do, and then trying to understand a bit better what are the most appropriate techniques for going about doing that. And I think that particularly with a lot of businesses, there's going to be a bit more of a focus on actually understanding what's going on, not just sort of blindly assuming that if you throw big data at machine learning algorithms, you're going to get something useful.
Okay, that's great. Mark, would you like to give us a little brief introduction and just give us some of your initial opinions about what the important trends have been and what you see coming in the next, certainly this year, next year, but a little farther out as well?
Sure. I'm Mark Woods. I work at Allstate Insurance Company, and I lead the decision modeling practice in place at Allstate. And I think the biggest thing that I've seen, I won't comment on industry trends. I do not have the expertise that some of these other panelists do. But certainly within our company, the important trend I'm seeing is our data scientists wanting to leverage decision models more and more, not so much to make their decisions explainable. That's still something I've been working with them on, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but more to provide a better way to capture the judgment rules that go along with their predictive models. So if we're using a predictive model to determine whether or not we want to request a motor vehicle report for a new auto insurance application, there's a bunch of judgmental rules that get added to that to make the decision about whether or not we ought to order that report from the Department of Motor Vehicles. And traditionally, data scientists have written all that stuff themselves. They've encoded it in Python or Groovy or something like that. More and more now they're coming to our decision modeling practice and wanting to partner with us to enable their predictive models to work together with our decision models, trying to take advantage of the best of both worlds.
Okay, great. James, with
All
your
right.
mask on.
I was like, you guys are probably all distant enough, so I'll let you off. All right.
All right.
So I'm James Taylor. I run Decision Management Solutions. We're a consulting firm specializing in decision management and decision modeling. We've probably modeled, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 decisions now over the last few years. We're one of the original submitters for DMN, so we're like deeply entwined with all this nonsense. In terms of trends, so I think the thing we've really noticed the last couple of years is a broader acceptance of the need to work top down. When we first started talking about DMN, everyone would go read the standard and they'd say, well, like 78% of it is feel. So clearly we should be focused on feel. And we're like, no, you should be focused on building a decision requirements model because otherwise it's pointless. And so we're having to do that less. We find more people are willing to are thinking top down. They're spending more time thinking about decision requirements. Obviously I have a book out there with Jan, Bruce's book, more and more sort of, methodologies out there saying, no, really, it's not about writing decision tables in a standard format. It's about rethinking how you think about the problem. I think the next couple of years, are really this move, as Mark was saying, around machine learning and AI, not just how do I coordinate several machine learning models and the judgmental rules that go with them into a single decision, but how do I do the business understanding step? If you're a crisp DM shop, everyone's into business understanding. What business problem am I trying to solve with machine learning? But there's no real methodology out there for saying, well, how do you define those requirements? And so we believe very strongly that decision modeling is great for that. And we're beginning to see interest and take up, as Mark is from machine learning, people go, oh, so I could actually sort of build the right machine learning model if I knew what decision I was trying to influence. And then I could capture data about not just how I came up with my score, but how my score was used in a decision. And that would be really helpful. So we're beginning, I'm hopeful that will change because we're wasting just a shit ton of money on machine learning and AI at the moment. We might as well pile it up and set fire to it, and at least we'd be warm. It's utterly wasted, most of it. And so I'd really, hope that's going to change. And then you asked a longer term one. I'm going to poke Sandy with this one because I think hopefully in the longer term, people will stop regarding decisions as subsidiaries of processes. I think there is a tendency to think, well, I've got to build my process model first, and then I can build decision models to go in it. And our experience is this is absolutely the worst thing to do in a significant percentage of processes. There are a significant percentage out there that exist in order to make a decision. And the only way to design an efficient process for that is to know what the decision is that you're trying to make. Mortgage refinance, credit accrue, claims payment. If you don't understand how you are going to decide, you cannot design an efficient process.
Well, and I think that requires that we change the way that business analysts do what they do. It's because it's a lot of this is driven by the business analyst saying, well, let's draw out the process. And then we start with process and then derive the decision.
I mean, to add to that, I've found that people design processes which in the end are trying to do the decisions, and then they kind of get to a point where, oh, I end up in spaghetti trying to do this bit, so I'll make this bit into some sort of decision, but they left all the spaghetti behind, that they did before they realized it. And yeah, you're dead right. You have to kind of understand what the decisions are before you let people out. I mean, just sort of people with BPMN go crazy.
Well, when I first started doing presentations on process and decisions together, which was a long time ago, I would kind of joke that if you let somebody who is from the process side draw this out, it would be like a spaghetti diagram with all of your decisions done as branches in there. And if you let the decision person do it, then there would be like a single step process that then calls a decision model.
That's the right way to do it. No, technically it has 3 steps, Sandy. Assemble data, make decision, do what the decision told you to do, right? So there's technically 3 steps in the process, right? Yeah.
Well, sometimes processes are more complex than that, but I take your point. Okay, so Carole-Ann, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what you think are the most important trends that we've been seeing in the recent past and what you think is coming in the very near term and then maybe a little further out?
Sure. Hi. Can you hear me okay to begin with?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm Carole-Ann Berlioz. I'm one of the co-founders of Sparking Logic, and we do technology. And Carlos will participate in the vendor panel tomorrow, so I don't want to talk about technology. I just want to share my experience. I'm working a lot of projects with customers on the credit side, insurance side, health side. So that's where I come from. What I've seen in the past, all this integration of model learning, machine learning, of integrating models to the business rules and things like that, I see that in every single project nowadays. I think it's very well adopted, at least in the projects that I see. What I've seen lately in the past year or so that has really changed is how our customers are really taking testing to the next level. When we started, we educated customers about having test cases and how to automate regression tests and do all of those things that are expected out of a decision management system. But in the past year, I've seen that going to the next level where they start now applying rules to the outcome of their rules just to analyze what happened. They don't want to know that, yes, I passed, or no, I failed the test, but they want to know why they failed the test. And they want to have a little bit of analysis done for them so that they can save hours of trying to look at the data and understanding why the rules are not producing what they should have. So it's very exciting to see this meta usage of the rules applied to the rules, and I'm looking forward to that trend continuing, because decision logic is more than just testing one table. Testing one table is great and it's important, but there is so much more complexity in the systems. When you look at acquiring reports, you want to make some decisions ahead of time. So it's more than 1 or 3 boxes, I would say, because you want to first assess, is it worth getting the data to begin with? If it's worth, then get the data, and maybe 1 report at a time and not everything at once. And all of this logic is becoming more and more sophisticated, even for the very big insurance companies that are not the most nimble. Typically, but now they start to have these more fine-grained decisioning about decisioning. So I find that really, really exciting, and I hope it continues.
Okay, great. Jan, it's if you'd like to give us just a little introduction and a little bit of your understanding of what you see as the important trends that have happened in the past year or so, and then things that are coming in the near term or a little bit further out.
I certainly will. Thank you. One of the great joys of going last in a presentation like this is you see all of the points that you'd thought of expressed much more eloquently and much more in a much more rounded way than you were thinking of, and you're left at the end. So hello everyone, my name's Jan Purchase. I run a consultancy, Lux Magi, which focuses on the bringing together of decision management and machine learning. A lot has been said about this particular combination. We focus mainly in the finance area, particularly on the application of natural language processing and conformal prediction to financial problems. I think you might expect me to say, therefore, that I'm a little more upbeat about the combination of machine learning and decision management than some people here. And it's true, but maybe for a different reason than you might suppose. Because whilst a lot of people have concentrated on what machine learning brings to decisions, the ability, for example, to combine statistical reasoning with human insight, I'd also like to point out that I think that machine learning is aided considerably by decision management itself. You consider all the possible ways that machine learning projects can go wrong, and there are so many of those. Poorly defined goals, no relationship to a business goal, a lack of integration with any kind of business process, a really fantastic launch, but very, very poor telemetry, i.e. no monitoring of how well systems are performing in real time. Machine learning just about, I beg your pardon, decision management just about helps with all of those problems, because it provides a firmly defined context for machine learning modules to contribute to an overall business decision and to bring human insight and statistical insight together, and to define very crisp and accurate APIs against which the deployment of machine learning models can be tested. So if you like, I'd like to think of the union as being that decision management makes machine learning projects more honest. I think that's a trend that will continue. I think it will help to provide a degree of equity and parity in decision making to combat some of the ethical concerns. I suppose one thing that no one else has mentioned this time, but has been discussed in previous decision camps, is on an entirely separate level, is my concern for something which I'd like to see happen in the next year, and I've wanted to see it in previous years, and that is that, in my experience, DNM is still very poorly understood by business analysts. Many are not even aware it exists, and that's something that we really need to address. We need to get that message beyond the cognoscenti, beyond those people that regularly deal with these systems, to the wider business analyst audience.
That's an excellent point, Jan. And I missed Brian as we went through the list the first time, but thought I would, save the best for last. So Brian, if you'd like to do a quick introduction and give us
and you have Alan
your
too,
thoughts
still,
on
I
the
think,
trends.
right?
So sorry, Jan, I get to steal your thunder for bringing up the rear here, but I'm Brian Stucky with Quicken Loans. I'm in our quantitative intelligence group within data science. Been working with rules and similar technologies for, gosh, a long time now, well over 20 years, and I've been really focused in mortgage and financial services during that time. There were two trends that I have noticed as of late, and I hope they are going to become stronger trends. I've seen them more than once, so hopefully that is indicative of a trend. The first is kind of an organic pickup of DMN use. And that is by people really just literally picking this up and thinking, you know what, this may apply to a problem. I never really saw this happen with traditional or classic business rule management system platforms. As one example, and this was coming from the technical side to our last point about business not grasping DMN yet. They had found it, latched onto it, and were doing some interesting ETL-ish kinds of things with DMN, which I may not have found an approach I would have suggested, but they liked it for the very fact that they could easily communicate what they were doing, which was fairly complex with a wider audience. And I've had a great deal of luck with that. And I've seen it happen a few times, and I think it's a testament to the OMG team that has put together the standard that that kind of thing can happen now. The other is that the idea of standardization is starting to get some people excited. BPMN is certainly a standard. It's acknowledged as the thing, but now with DMN thrown in and more industries creating some standards, the incredible opportunities that can be provided from a standardized approach to things is getting a little bit more traction. Going forward, I think, is really going to echo a lot of what everybody said here with respect to machine learning. I was taken last year at DecisionCAMP by our keynote speaker from Forrester that put up the equation on a slide, ML plus MO plus DD equals AI. These three things together, machine learning, mathematical optimization, and digital decisions, are really powerful, but together is where we're going to get the real bang for the buck in a lot of ways. I'm dating myself now age-wise, but way back when we were looking at case-based reasoning, we were examining, well, how do we combine rules and cases? Do we run the rules till they run out and then go to a case approach? Machine learning and data is really our case-based world now. There's a whole avenue to see how they can work in conjunction, how one can provide oversight, how one can provide explanation. all the kinds of things we've had literally over the last few hours during our presentations and conversations today.
Great. Those are some good points. Now, I've been watching some of the questions come up on Slack, and definitely both Matteo and James were talking about how trying to get more awareness in both the C-suite and business analysts to know more about decision modeling and DMN. And that's exactly the question that I have. So I work some amount, I do more technical architecture, but I work a lot with process analysts as well, business analysts. And although the concepts of process seem to come to them more naturally in terms of tell us about your business and they'll start drawing a process, how do we get them to start thinking about processes and decisions together and what's going to be required? James points out that it's in the BABOK already about decision management, but it's obviously not getting used. If any of you want to sort of take a stab at that.
James.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I just wanted to answer that specific question. You're quite right. It is in the BABOK, which I would have thought would be, a good first step. But this is the IRM I was speaking to, and their technical panel leads discussing a possible presentation at the BA conference later this year, and they said you're going to have to tell us more about this this DMN thing. We've not heard of it. And I asked them if they'd heard of BPMN, and they said yes. But they said, look, most business analysts, and admittedly this is Europe, I don't know if it's a European phenomenon, but most business analysts have not heard of this. You'll have to introduce it from scratch.
You see, BPMN has better marketing.
It does, but I would also say there's a couple of things. First of all, there's a lot more BPMN vendors out there, and they've been out there spending money on BPMN marketing a lot longer, right? So there's that, right? The rules industry has a long track record of being much more interested in clawing each other's eyes out for a bigger share of the pie than making the share of the pie bigger. And so, there's vendors involved in DMN whose tendency is to snipe at each other's algorithms and shit like that, rather than talk about how great rules are. So we have some things we're pushing against. But I think the bigger issue is a relatively simple one. When we meet analysts, what we find is that for process analysts, there's a lot of people who are not really analysts. They're process documenters. They can use BPMN to document a process perfectly competently. They don't analyze the process. And one of the challenges with DMN is there's no equivalent. You can't just document a decision with DMN. You really have to analyze it. It only really works. It only adds any value if you actually analyze the decision. And so I think one of the challenges is that it's a little bit, that it's a smaller percentage perhaps of the business analyst population who are really analysts rather than requirements documenters, and they find it harder to use DMN. We've had much more success, for instance, teaching data analysts DMN than process analysts, because pretty much you can't be a data analyst if you can't think logically about data, right? So they don't have a hard time thinking logically about decisions, whereas when we do process audiences, we find we have to pretty quickly sort of filter them into the two buckets. Are you really analytical when you look at a process, or are you just a requirements documenter who knows what BPMN notation means? So I'm curious if Sandy thinks that's a valid issue when you think about the number of people,
Yeah, and I take your point that the value in having a business analyst looking at decisions is analyzing it, but I would argue the same is also true for processes, is that if you were just documenting them, it's not really that, it might be a little bit useful, but there's other ways to do automated documentation of processes through process mining and task mining and so on. The value really comes in, can you analyze them and then figure out what they should be, as opposed to just saying, well, this is what they are right now, which is like a mess.
Yes. I do agree with James's analysis of the fact that in order to use DMN, you need to go one step further than you will be with DMN analyzing a process. I think it does require this additional analysis, very similar to the data models as he mentioned. So I'm in total agreement with that. I think it's what makes it really hard, where in data, there is this value of spending the time and making your diagrams. With business rules, the gap between the model and the rules implementation is not that big. So people who want to implement a project, they are ready, they are, they want to do the analysis and get it done. They're not seeing as much of a value in doing this work ahead of time compared to the value they get in creating a data model ahead of time. And I think this has been an issue for the adoption. A lot of the companies that we see, they don't want to invest this time. They want to jump directly into the implementation. Some of them are really early on and they will spend the time, but they will probably start with James or someone else. But agreeing with Jen, I think there are a lot of companies, a lot of business that have never been to this DecisionCAMP, that have never been to any of the business rules type of events, and they have never heard of DMN. Very true.
That's a good point. There was Bruce had a comment on Slack, just that James is correct about who can learn DMN more easily, because of course Bruce does a lot of training in this.
Okay.
Bruce, I don't know if you want to unmute your mic. You're welcome to kind of add your comments in here. It might be easier than typing them into Slack, but I'm also interested in, like, how do we get this sort of joint sense of having both of these together, and who can learn them, and what's the best way to leverage them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with James' point about, process people versus data people, and learning DMN. Data people understand it more easily. There's the top-down aspect, which people have commented on. In my BPMN method and style, the method part asks process people to decompose the process top-down, and they find that the most difficult piece of it. So it just,
Right.
it's, business people are naturally bottom-up thinkers. They can be trained to think top-down, but it's, it's work. And so I think education is a key part of this. You can't expect people to just take what they know already and just do it. I think it takes conditioning them to a methodology.
Right.
But I mean, part of the challenge, I think, is that people are sort of thinking in terms of, what am I doing now, instead of thinking, why am I doing this? And so kind of trying to think, am I even doing the right thing? And they're not starting from the perspective of saying, why am I doing this? And then working backwards from that to say, okay, this is why I'm doing it. These are the decisions I need to make. This is the process I need to have. And if you're sort of sitting there saying, I'm going to build my process model on the basis of what the guys are already doing, you're not going to get a better process. And if you're not thinking about what decisions you need to make, you're going to carry on trying to make the same decisions as you did before. And so you're not going to remodel those. So as Carole-Ann was saying, you can jump straight in and start writing the rules if you're essentially going to re-implement your old decisions. But if they're not the right decisions, then you're not really going to move any further forwards. And the way I've always approached DMN is very much as much more a kind of requirements gathering process and very high level design. I mean, I don't kind of have a great deal of attraction in terms of using it as an implementation model, but using it as a way of actually getting people to talk about what they're doing and capturing what they actually need to do, I think is where its real power is. When you get down to things like decision tables, well, it's kind of like SQL, which is very useful, but it doesn't tell you what you need to do. It just tells you how to do it.
Right, and there's a number of points over on the Slack channel that are talking about, just about what type of modeling is more natural to people and so on. So I think there's a lot of open questions in here.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Carole-Ann.
I just wanted to interject. I think it was very true 10 years ago that people didn't know where to start with business rules, and they were just cataloging the rules that already existed. I think that there has been an evolution. The business analysts I meet, they don't say, I want to make the same decision, and they know the purpose. They're like, for example, I would like to create a quote service. I would like to create an eligibility service. I have my underwriting rules. I have, you know, whatever they are already thinking in terms of a decision. And that's a great evolution. It wasn't the case 10 years ago. And now I think, you know, almost every customer I meet, they are already at that level. So there has been progress. I think we're not giving them enough credit. I think they are smarter and they are doing much better than they used to be.
They've still got a long way to go.
Maybe in the UK.
You know, I think we found some of this transition easier, at least in the domain I'm in, from the business side. The IT side has, to your point, Carole-Ann, latched onto the idea of doing something. We're making a decision, a determination. There's a functionality piece here embedded in some way. Using decision tables is getting the business side. I can get buy-in by saying this isn't that different from what you have in Excel, and they're all living in it. So for better or worse, I'm like, that's one step I can always take to get them to take a look at DMN and start to see that this is a better way to do things.
I think I'm more with IT than I am with a business analyst. The business analysts are those that have really moved on to that level. I'm very proud of our business analysts. They're doing really good.
Whenever I've engaged on the IT side, what I tend to see is IT people that are interested in decision modeling and wanting to use it, but lacking the analytical skill set that a business analyst would bring to the table. So they are generally just re-implementing what they already have written in code, or trying to model a decision around what the existing code base needs.
Yes.
As opposed to asking the question, what's the real conclusion I'm trying to reach here that has business value?
Yeah, we have a client doing that right now, a very large re-implementation project, and they're doing exactly what Mark just described. And while on the one hand, it's incredibly frustrating for someone like me who would like to build it top down and everything else, right? The fact that they are at least thinking about, well, what decision do these rules contribute to? Why are these the set of rules? Where do they go? Do they go in the same set of rules as this set of rules? Are they answering the same question? It's still actually materially improving the quality of the rules they're writing, despite the fact that they're doing it essentially wrong, right? So I think, but I do think that the top-down thing is really important. One of the things, the top-down thinking is I think the critical challenge, right? When we talk to customers and we engage directly with business owners and we say, okay, we're going to build a decision requirements diagram. It takes like 2 seconds to explain what one is, right? Because they're very simple diagrams. And then you start building them, and they do know how they want to decide. And what's fascinating is how enthusiastic they get, because I'll say, well, so how do you decide? And it turns out no one's ever asked them this before. They've been asked, what are your rules? What data do you need? How do you want the system to work? What are your requirements? They've been asked all these other questions, but no one's ever said, you decide if we're going to pay this claim and not pay that claim. How? Tell me how you decide. And they're like, they love to tell you. And so people are always telling me, oh, our business users don't really know, our underwriters are stupid, they don't understand the problem. Now I'm like, no, you're wrong. You just never asked them a sensible question, nor have you had any way to capture what they know in a way that really works. And decision requirements diagrams do. And so it's, to Carole-Ann's point, it's frustrating because you really want to get in front of everybody and tell them this, because they could all do so much better, but they just don't know about it, right? And they don't have someone who's got that top-down thinking to come and lead them through that thought process and get it modeled.
Right.
So how do we get it out there then?
Sorry, Sadie.
I was going to say Alan's had his hand up for a while. I don't know if it's related to this conversation or was it?
Yes, well, this and the previous one. Firstly, I want to agree with James. Absolutely, there's nothing like that expression of delight that comes over a room full of people when they realize that they can actually express the way they do things in a clear, understandable way, which actually gives them back the responsibility that they always thought they ought to have. But I was thinking more generally about business analysis and what we're making available to business analysts nowadays. We're in an interesting situation where we have three standards which are growing in maturity: BPMN, CMMN, and DMN, and they overlap with each other in that there are things you can do in BPMN or DMN, and there are pros and cons of where you put things. There are things you could do in BPMN and CMMN, and you know, pros and cons of whether you model things as a case or a process. And there are things overlap between CMMN and DMN, whether handing off a case as a decision, all that sort of stuff. So the analyst actually has choices to make all the time about how and where to model things. And there are pros and cons about what the decisions they make. Now, this is both a good thing and a problem. It is a good thing because analysis is always about being creative and finding a neat way to model something, and in a way that will work for the customer, in a way that's maintainable over time, and all these things. And you need to have flexibility to do things in different ways. But it means that an analyst who's going to be capable of doing this has to know all three standards. And I think we're asking a lot more of people now in order to keep up with the development in these standards.
I'd agree with that. And Dania's made a comment on Slack is saying that awareness is the main issue. And I think that awareness of how to use those three standards together and when to use one versus the other is one of the biggest problems that I have. Like I will talk to people inside organizations and I say, well, there's these three standards. Maybe you don't need all of them all of the time. You probably need at least two of them most of the time. And they just kind of get a little bit overwhelmed. And there's also the secondary issue, and I'd really love the panel to sort of think about this, is that when you have a representation of a process, for example, how do you then look at how the decisions fit together with that process? How do you have somebody look at one representation of what their business is doing and understand it without maybe having to go kind of two different places? Because then people get caught up in like, oh, I have to go to the process for this, and then I have to go to the decision model for this.
So just one observation and then an answer to that question. So Sandy, I, by and large, only work with people who we're only trying to teach one methodology, one notation to, right? Because we don't do process models and we don't do case models. We really only do decisions, right? We're all decisions all the time. And all the problems we're talking about are all still true. So I don't think it's because there are three standards, or because, though Alan makes and you make perfectly good points, that there are choices to make and there are a group of people who have to use them together. But even when all we are trying to do is design a decision service, that's it. That's all we're trying to do, right? We're just trying to figure out what this decision service does. We still have these problems, right? So I think there is it exacerbates the problem, but it doesn't cause it, right? I think the multiple standards are a sort of orthogonal issue to the thing. And now I've forgotten your other question, so you should ask somebody else. So.
Well, I think
old age rears its ugly head, I tell you.
I mean, all I was going to add to it really is that you have to break down what you're trying to explain to people into relatively simple terms. I mean, I think the sort of the BPN recommendations I heard is you shouldn't have more than you should have between 7 to 9 boxes on your on your BPMN diagram, and
yeah, it should fit on a page.
It becomes difficult to make sense of. So whenever you're talking about these things, you really want to say, I'm going to break it down to something which is, you can put it on a PowerPoint slide and people can read all of the text. And if it needs to be more detailed than that, then basically you start nesting things and you can take people into the boxes that they're interested in. And that's the kind of way to kind of keep people, I think, focused on what they understand. And you don't really need to worry too much about what technology you're doing, because I mean, you can drill down in all of the notations, and it's still just boxes which are connected together. And it doesn't require rocket science to understand basic BPM diagrams any more than it does DMN diagrams or what is it? I can never remember CMMN diagrams, but it's a matter of kind of, you know, getting people to understand that they need to be able to kind of focus at different levels, and you get too many people who are sort of interested in what's down at the bottom without kind of working down to that level to understand how it fits in the whole picture.
Yeah, I remember my point I was going to make. I think the key issue here is no, I've forgotten again. I've forgotten I need another cup of coffee. Clearly,
Jane is just not on form today.
I don't want to say about process and rules together. Even though they make sense, and you know, yes, there are some standards and some ways to expose that to business analysts. On the day-to-day, I don't see a lot of business analysts working on the process beyond the first Visio diagram, but they spend day after day working on the business rules. So once it's implemented by the orchestration layer, there's really no interest at all from the business analyst to go and make modifications. Every couple of years, there might be an operational improvement project, but it's not a day-to-day effort. But business rules are a day-to-day effort, and that's why I think they need to be more accessible to them. I don't think that the DMN versus BPMN or something else is an issue so much as you know, as the awareness issue with DMN, the fact that we need to bring more value with DMN rather than going into an implementation layer directly.
I think
I remember my point. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah. Sorry, the rules are what changes. That's always been the notion behind business rule management, and now decision management processes should not and do not change that dramatically. The rules do, so you would kind of expect that. However, if it is not placed properly to begin with, and the process is not laid out in the decision points map to start with, then it's not going to be a very fruitful effort.
Yeah, Brian, I think that's a great point, because I've certainly seen it where the existing process is how the code base does it today, how the existing application works. So rather than analyzing it from a process flow standpoint and thinking about my decision task and the order they need to go in, there's no context then for the decision for determining, well, what really is the conclusion? As an example, am I trying to determine whether this person is eligible for a discount or how much of that discount they're going to get?
Or what price I'm going to give them at the end.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Because if I think my thing is, you're applying, Mark, I want to tell you what it's going to cost you to insure your car. That's one decision. If I say, well, no, I've got this process, and first of all, I've got to decide what the base price is, then I've got to decide what the discount is, then I've got to decide how much the discount you're eligible for, then I've got to decide if there are any promotions to apply. Well, now I've got 4 decisions. Well, no, you still have one decision. You still have to decide how much this price is going to be, but you've just broken it up into randomly assigned pieces because you thought you had process tasks.
Right.
Look, healthcare claims. We have a healthcare claims customer. They must have 50 steps in a process, which in my mind are all basically the sort of sub decisions of a decision, whether they should pay their claim or not. Well, first of all, we've got to do knockout rules for this and knockout rules for that. And they've got like all these steps in the process. And I'm like, you don't need this process. I mean, half of it is just about applying different sets of rules at different steps. And that's really one decision task. And Bruce has this point in his book, and so did Jana. So this is epidemic, right? This sort of lack of focus. Anyway, the point I was going to make earlier was, I'm curious what other people think. We see a little bit of a challenge with the D word, decision, right? We mean by it in DMN something quite specific, right? A repeatable decision, the way you make a decision, not a specific decision about a customer. And I'm curious that there's some sense sometimes that because we're talking about decisions, that we get ourselves in a little, we're on the back foot a little bit. Well, that's what I do, that's what people do. You're asking me about, you're trying to take my job away, and there's a sort of a resistance to it. And I'm curious if anybody else feels like that's something they have to unpick before they can really get people to sort of understand what we're talking about with DMN.
James,
I've not had that
that's a very
issue
good point.
before.
Well, I ended up with a kind of discussion with Ron Ross, where he was sort of saying something which I had kind of described as being a decision service or something. Oh, that's just rules. And I, no, Ron, I'm making a decision here. And he said, well, no, you're not. And there sort of seemed to be, I mean, it is a word which has got perhaps multiple connotations. But I mean, the thing is that the way that I always try and kind of present it as being, it is essentially an active process that we're making. We're taking some data and we're producing an outcome which essentially has some consequence, and what we're doing is we're making a decision. Here's this input. This is the correct response to this set of circumstances. So I mean, perhaps there is a slight problem with the word, but the thing is that what else can we use? I think the thing is we just have to kind of, when we talk about it, we have to make it clear that what we're doing is we're essentially creating components which are taking cases and saying this is the treatment for that case, or and putting it very much in terms of, it is like, someone's come in to the bank. Am I going to give them a loan? Someone's come into the shop and they're asked, they're saying, I want to buy something like this. What am I going to recommend to them? And it is very, very much an activity that it's an active thing that we're doing, but it's not one decision. It's the case that we have in front of us, but the next case we're going to do something different with.
I think I'm running into very different type of issues with business analysts. I think they understand what a decision is, and all of that is really no problem. Where I think there is a gap and we need to help them be more educated is on how to organize your business rules around those decisions. They tend to put everything together at once, and kind of the opposite of what James was encountering. They want that one system that computes everything, and they mix the eligibility rules with the pricing rules, with the underwriting rules, and everything gets all together. And the effort is really to say, well, let's put all of those eligibility rules together. Let's put all of these quote systems together. It doesn't mean that they have to be completely independent, that they have to be invoked at different times by the process, but just in terms of organizing your thoughts. And I think this is really what is the most difficult part, I think, for practitioners to become really proficient, to become excellent at writing business rules.
I have a question to all of you, as this is a panel of practitioners and it's almost over. While we all look like we're in agreement, but probably we could have the same discussion 2 years ago and we will express exactly the same points. But this is 2020, and our initial questions to you as people who actually know what's happening in the field, in real organization, especially that's why Mark here, Brian here, what's special in this year and what do you expect next year? Do we really do you see anything new from architectural point of view, from any other point of view? And for example, financially, it's so difficult these days. What do you expect?
I loved Alan's presentation this morning about this concept of decision templates. That's something we've been playing around with in an effort to make decision modeling more accessible to our data scientists specifically. We would like for anybody doing data analytics within the company to be able to express their development of things like features for machine learning algorithms as decision models.
For sure.
And the concept is not hard, but the tooling is a barrier. And I think this idea of decision templates holds a lot of promise if we can provide people with an outline or patterns for certain types of decisions and let them just fill in the rules then, as it were.
Yeah.
I have a request, if I may, that I'd like to see happen in the next year. Calling really all vendors out there, will you please, please, please stop thinking that a line by line, sometimes many thousands of lines of a rule log in any way constitutes any kind of explanation for what's going on, because it doesn't.
Indeed, of anything, yes. It's
So
a debugging
please
frame.
sort that
Yes.
out. Please
Let's
sort
stop.
that out.
Right, yes. Yeah, no, agreed. Yeah.
I totally agree. I mean, as a vendor, I totally agree. We've been fighting that battle forever, telling people the audit is not what you want. They still want it, and we're giving it to them. We finally gave up and say, you have it, but we're still giving them design patterns for organizing their explanations. And the explanation internally is different from the explanation they might have printed on a paper saying, I'm sorry, you don't qualify. And all of that we see very much within our customer base, what they do. So we're fighting that battle as well.
Okay, this has been a great discussion, but we are at the end of our day. I know for those of you who are in Europe, it's getting to be a little bit late. I'm just going to put up the schedule for tomorrow, and Jacob, if you'd like to just any discussion about what we're going to be seeing tomorrow.
I just want to thank all participants and all presenters today. And this is our first time when we doing everything online, and it seems so far it works not bad. And hopefully tomorrow we will learn from today's mistakes, and it will be even better. And I wish you a great end of the day, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Jacob.
everybody.
Thanks, Sandy.
It's great. Thanks, Sandy.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
See you all tomorrow.
Brilliant start.
Bye.
Brilliant start. Well done.
Thank you all.